remember standing in a hallway outside a radio studio in Harlem late winter 1963. The walls were painted an institutional green, and someone had left a window cracked open. Cold air moved through that corridor like it had somewhere to go. Malcolm X was waiting in the same hallway 20 feet away. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't rehearsing. He was simply standing there, his hands folded in front of him, looking at nothing in particular. I had seen him speak twice before, once at a rally in Newark, once on a local television program where the host kept interrupting him. But this was different. This was a man alone with his thoughts, and I happened to be there. I nodded. He nodded back. Neither of us spoke. And in that silence, I understood that the man I had been sent to cover was not the same man standing in that hallway. The microphones were not on yet. The cameras were not rolling. And without them, he seemed smaller somehow. Not in stature, but in the weight he carried. He looked tired. I had been covering the news long enough to know that America preferred its figures in clear categories. Heroes and villains, patriots and agitators, but Malcolm X did not fit cleanly into either frame, and that made him dangerous to people who needed certainty. I was sent to interview dangerous men before. I knew how to keep my voice level, my questions fair. What I did not know, standing in that hallway, was that I was watching a man in the middle of changing his mind. And in 1963, that was the most dangerous thing a public man could do. When we finally sat down for the interview, he was precise. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He answered my questions the way a man answers when he has thought about them long before you asked. I asked him about violence. I asked him about integration. I asked him about Dr. King. He did not flinch, but I noticed that he paused before answering. Not because he was uncertain, but because he was choosing his words with the care of someone who knew they would be used against him. The Malcolm X that most Americans knew in those years was the one they saw in brief clips on the evening news. A sharp suit, a pointed finger, a voice that did not apologize. The press called him angry. They called him hateful. They called him the most dangerous man in America. And he did not correct them. He let the country believe what it needed to believe. But I had begun to notice something in the moments before and after those speeches. I saw him in green rooms, in hallways, in the brief minutes when the event had ended but the crowd had not yet dispersed. And in those moments he was different. He was watchful. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, away from the microphones, his voice lost some of that edge, not all of it, but enough that I wondered what he sounded like when no one was recording him at all. I did not know Malcolm Little. I knew Malcolm X, and Malcolm X was a creation, part his own, part ours. He had built himself into something unmovable, something that could not be ignored. The Nation of Islam had given him a framework, a family, a mission. Elijah Muhammad had given him a father he never had. And for years that seemed to be enough. But by 1963, I began to sense fractures. Nothing overt, nothing he would say directly. But there were pauses in his speeches that had not been there before. There were questions from reporters that he deflected rather than answered. And there were moments, brief, barely visible, when he seemed to be looking past the audience, as if searching for something that was not in the room. I was not the only one who noticed. The Nation of Islam noticed, the FBI noticed, and Malcolm X, I believe, noticed that he was being noticed. I remember one conversation we had off the record after another taping. He asked me what I thought white America wanted from him. It was not a rhetorical question. He was genuinely curious. I told him the truth as I understood it. They wanted him to be wrong. They wanted him to be proof that anger was irrational, that separatism was backward, that the problem was not the country, but the people complaining about it. He nodded slowly. Then he said something I have never forgotten. He said, "They want me to be simple, but I'm not." That was 1963. By 1964, the simplicity was gone. I was not present the day Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam. I read about it the way most people did, in the papers, in statements released through intermediaries, in the careful language of men, trying not to start a war. But I understood what it meant. He had spent more than a decade building his identity within that organization. He had recruited for them, defended them, become their most visible voice, and now he was walking away. The press wanted to know why. They wanted scandal, betrayal, drama. But Malcolm X did not give them that. He said he wanted to work more broadly. He said he wanted to engage with the civil rights movement in ways the Nation of Islam would not allow. He said it was time for a new phase. What he did not say, at least not publicly, not yet, was that he had begun to doubt, not his anger, not his analysis of America's racial sins, but the answers he had been given, the certainty he had been taught. The walls that had once felt like protection now felt like confinement. I saw him twice in the months after the split. Both times he was different, not softer. Malcolm X was never soft, but more open. He spoke about his trip to Mecca, about praying alongside men of all races, about realizing that the enemy was not a color, but a system. He spoke carefully, as if testing new language, seeing how it sounded out loud. And I saw in his eyes something I had not seen before, uncertainty, not weakness, uncertainty, the kind that comes when a man realizes the world is larger and more complicated than he was told. But America was not interested in a Malcolm X who was evolving. They had decided who he was. The cameras had frozen him in place, finger raised, voice sharp, threat incarnate. And even as he tried to step outside that frame, the frame followed him. I remember thinking, watching him during those last months, that he was running out of time. Not because I had any specific knowledge, but because I had been a reporter long enough to know what happens to men who become symbols. They do not get to retire. They do not get to change quietly. The world holds them to the version of themselves it needs, and if they try to become something else, the world does not forgive them. Malcolm X had enemies on all sides by then. The Nation of Islam felt betrayed. The FBI had been watching him for years. White America still saw him as a dangerous agitator, and even among those who might have been his allies, there was suspicion. He had been too harsh for too long. He had burned too many bridges. And now, when he tried to rebuild, people remembered the fires. I was not surprised when I heard he had received death threats. I was not surprised when he told reporters he did not expect to live much longer. What surprised me was how calmly he said it, as if he had already accepted what was coming, as if he had decided that speaking his mind, even as it changed, was worth the cost. On February 21st, 1965, I was in the newsroom when the word came through. Malcolm X had been shot at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. Multiple gunmen, close range. He was dead. I do not remember what I said. I remember the noise in the newsroom, going quiet for a moment, then resuming. Louder than before. I remember someone saying it was inevitable. I remember someone else saying it was a shame. And I remember thinking that neither of those things was enough. We reported the facts. We showed the footage. We interviewed people who had been there, people who had known him, people who had opposed him. And in all of that coverage, we tried to tell the story of Malcolm X. But I am not certain we succeeded, because the story we told was the story of a man who had been angry, who had preached separation, who had frightened white America and divided black America, and who had died violently, the way violent men often do. That was the narrative. It was neat, it was understandable, and it was incomplete. The Malcolm X I knew, or thought I knew, was more than that. He was a man who had survived a brutal childhood, who had educated himself in prison, who had found purpose in a movement that gave him structure and belonging. And then, when that structure became a cage, he had walked out of it. Not because he had given up his convictions, but because his convictions had grown larger than the container that held them. He was still becoming himself when he died. That is what I think about most, not what he was, but what he might have been. I have reported on many deaths in my career, presidents, soldiers, ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, and I have learned that death has a way of simplifying people. It turns them into lessons, symbols, warnings. But Malcolm X deserved more than that. He deserved the chance to keep changing, to keep questioning, to keep searching for a truth that fit the complexity he had lived. America did not give him that chance, and I wonder sometimes what we lost when we stopped listening before he had finished speaking. I think about that hallway in Harlem, the cold air, the silence, a man standing alone, gathering his thoughts before facing the microphones again. He looked tired, but he did not look defeated. And that is how I prefer to remember him, not as the symbol we made him, but as the man he was trying to become. That is all. Good night.